multiplicity of many, many realities, many truths, as well as of the whole, the deep space that is visible at night, that is not visible during the day. See, the moon is not just this inferior symbol compared to the sun, as it is in a literalist point of view, where the sun is this, powerful star that we're completely centered on as a planet and for life and for energy and so forth. The moon is just this rock that's a satellite of the Earth. It seems like another form of patriarchy that got built into the mythological systems that make that alignment. But the moon is much more mysterious a symbol. It's a symbol, just as the sun's the ruler of the day and the moon's the ruler of the night. The moon is the ruler in some sense, or is the symbol of the whole. It's of deep space. It's of the mystery. It has of the whole. It's also where sleep and dreams and that dimension of consciousness and the unconscious exist. It's also the great symbol of that which, where darkness and light coexist in a much more mysterious, interflowing way, compared with the solar journey, which is a decisive, conquest of darkness at birth, at dawn, the heroic trajectory, and then the dying into the night. So keeping in mind that solar-lunar mythic polarity, synchronicities seem to be that place where they come together. It's a kind of coincidentia oppositorum, to use Jung's term from alchemy, a coincidence of opposites, where the larger mystery, that which is coming from what our solar Cartesian consciousness is unconscious of. You get that? It's not that the anima mundi, the cosmic soul of things, is the unconscious. It's just what a certain form of consciousness is unconscious of, and that's why we call it the unconscious. But it's much deeper, grander, and more encompassing than that. And so in this third stage, where we move into more of a kind of quality of life where we are participants in the unfolding artistry of life, the trickster playfulness of it, but also, as the stopwatch example suggests, it is a kind of, it can serve a compensatory function within the psyche. It can help remind us of what we may not be conscious of in our narrow-minded conscious focus of the ego awareness, in the way that Jung used the stopwatch to basically correct himself and say, what am I not taking into account? By the way, that's an example of a synchronicity that doesn't have that same, let's say, overpowering force as on its own terms, as the scarab, the golden scarab example, which kind of comes in and awakens the Cartesian-minded patient to a bigger worldview and basically transforms her whole frame of reference. The stopped watch, first of all, isn't really changing Jung's worldview. It's just changing his sense of what he's been up to for the previous half hour. And he's using it as a kind of correction for his way of looking at a particular phenomenon, namely whether the book should be published. Well, what I want you to attend to in this case is how he's using something that many people in that situation would look at their stopwatch and say, damn it, I just had that watch fixed, and now it's not working. All right, back to the conversation. No, I don't think the book should be published, and the interview's at an end. I think what we're looking at there is Jung, I think, already is vaguely conscious of, vaguely aware of something that's eating at him, that he may be wrong on this kind of one side, especially when he notices that he's getting a little charged about it, getting a little sharp. That's often the sense that a complex is being activated. And when the complex is activated, you start filtering out things that you should be paying attention to, and you get more self-righteous in your perspective to drive it home. And by I think he was a conscious enough person, and he was someone who often was, right to the end of his life, someone who struggled with charge that would come up, anger that would come up in a situation, his moodiness, his anima, as he would call it, running the show at times, and he'd always have to be stepping back and getting that psychological reflexivity to be able to live more skillfully. And so in this case, he used that stopwatch for his own psychological benefit in a way that, as I used this phrase yesterday, it was a defeat for his ego, but it was a victory for his self, that higher self that was taking into account more the whole of the situation. All right, now, this morning we just heard a brilliant presentation of the evidence that Ian Stevenson began. I remember first reading that in the, I guess it was early 70s at Esalen, when 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation first started becoming widely read. And one could not but, I mean, like many other people by that time, in the early 70s, late 60s, I was quite open to the idea that reincarnation was a fact of life. In fact, when we had a gathering of a lot of past life therapy experts, Stan Groff, who I've worked with the most over the last 30 years, has a whole body of evidence that's just very powerful healings that take place once one can access the memories that are related to another lifetime or even a series of lifetimes that seem to be connected to psychological syndromes and symptoms and complexes that are problematically shaping one's current existence. And by reliving that death on the battlefield where the shoulder was speared, and then suddenly at the end of that, in this case, a holotropic breathwork session that happened at Esalen, pain that had been affecting him for decades in his shoulder was suddenly gone. That type of thing, there's just so many instances of it. And like Ian Stevenson and like our speaker this morning, Jim Tucker, they don't leap to like this is definitely actually real. Even though they may privately hold that, because we're in a scientifically informed, science still has to a great extent the upper hand, the center of gravity in the cultural worldview. It's very important to keep that kind of balance between here's the evidence and presenting it in that kind of dispassionate way that Jim presented it this morning and that Ian Stevenson presented it. It has its own power that way, and you don't have to drive it in. You just present it, and it's all the more effective. Now that example that he gave, or the many examples that he gave, would have been the kind of thing that Jung would have categorized as one of the forms of synchronicity. And when he talked about, when synchronicity, the paper, I mentioned, that in the late 20s he first started referring to the synchronistic phenomenon, but he waited 20 full years before he gave the final Aranos lecture in 1951 on synchronicity, and then the next year he wrote the full monograph called Synchronicity, an Acausal Connecting Principle. And that word acausal is very crucial for Jung, because what he wanted to do was to basically take the modern worldview that has just the focus on linear efficient causality. This billiard ball hits that billiard ball, and the second billiard ball moves with the force and the direction that has been imparted to it by the first billiard ball. That kind of very straightforward linear causal way of looking at it. Jung, by having the word acausal, he wanted to just say there's something else going on here. And these coincidences that are happening that are meaningful do not seem to be anything that can be explained by linear causality. And because the word causal in the modern worldview had been kind of deeply impoverished by the modern vocabulary and the modern way of looking at things to only mean linear causality, linear mechanistic efficient causality of the billiard ball type, he felt he needed to use the word acausal. But when you look at how he actually talked about synchronicities, he often used words like when the archetype or the archetypal complex becomes very powerful in that person's psyche, it can constellate or it can arrange. It seems to arrange the events to reflect what's going on in the inner life. So, for example, the dream that I think a woman is talking about a dream that she was having had that was very significant in her life involving a silver fox. As she's talking to Jung, about 20, 30 feet in front of them on the path, a silver fox crosses the path. It's that type of example that filled Jung's life. And by contrast, when you talk about the fact that the archetypes seemed to be arranging the event that reflected also what was going on in the inner life, the golden scarab, the symbol of the golden scarab, the archetypal death rebirth process seemed to inform both the inner dream that she was describing and the external insect that came in the window. Well, that's a type of causality. It's archetypal causation. Aristotle called that formal cause. It's shaping the form. So that's a type of causality for the ancients, particularly Aristotle. And also, all synchronicities for Jung tended to be moving the psyche towards wholeness, towards an integration of what was unconscious to integrate it into consciousness. And so it's moving us into a more whole state psychically, where conscious and unconscious come together. And in that sense, there seems to be a telos, a purpose, that is informing the synchronicity. Now, for Aristotle, that too was called a cause. He called that the final cause, or you could call it the teleological cause. So while I think synchronicities can definitely be seen as not relating to the efficient causality of Aristotle, the billiard ball hitting the other billiard ball, it does seem to reflect this more amplified, nuanced categorizing of causality that Aristotle left us with, where both formal causation, like the archetypal cause that's at work, and final cause, which is that movement towards wholeness, behind which is always the self archetype in Jungian sense, capital S, the self archetype. The self archetype is pulling us towards wholeness. It's pulling us to individuate into becoming the person that we were meant to be, that is an expression of the cosmos in us, that only you can be, in the same way that acorn has to turn into an oak tree, and you can only turn into your particular form of cosmic being. That's what his understanding of individuation had so much to do with not just breaking out of the crowd's collective conformity. It also and then just becoming a separate individual. It also had to that's kind of the earlier stages of the heroic individuation process. But the full heroic trajectory involves an initiatory descent. The sun has to go down. There has to be a dying, a dying into the whole, a self-submitting, self-surrendering embrace of the whole on behalf of the whole, on behalf of life. And in that descent, you get an individuation that regrounds us in the whole, so that one way of putting it is, in our earlier stages of life where we are kind of getting a sense of who we are as an individual, you can have a very strong sense of being very special. Like, and that specialness, it can range from just being healthy specialness to being very narcissistic, inflated specialness. But we all have it to the extent that we've gained any degree of egoic development. But then in the encounter with mortality, the encounter with death, the encounter with severe loss, we have an experience that brings us down to the level of, wow, I'm like everybody else. I'm going to die, just like every single other person has died before me. I'm going to die. I'm not special. I'm a common human being. And that's part of the descent. It's part of the dark night of the soul.
That's you drop your dark sunglasses.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. The Hollywood look, the star. But then it's part of the death rebirth mystery that, having drunk that bitter drink to the dregs, like the Garden of Gethsemane kind of, drinking human mortality to the dregs, that I'm just a finite human being, and you sort of lose this kind of immortality illusion that is part of the puer, the eternal child. And in that dying, one actually reconnects to the cosmic ground. The archetypal forces of death and rebirth work within one. You access it. That's what every shaman goes through, every ancient death rebirth mystery initiate goes through. Every person who's a twice born has this experience where they suddenly realize, yes, they actually are special in a certain way, but not in a way that is like superior to everybody else. They're special because the cosmos has individuated in them in a unique way, and that they have their particular gift and service to the whole that is unique. So it's a different form of specialness that emerges. Okay, so when we're talking about these different forms of causality, the final cause, the teleological cause, that seems to be at work in so many synchronicities, where it's moving the person towards wholeness. That wholeness that is driven by the self archetype. So there's a telos at work. There's a purpose at work, and it's not completely acausal in that sense. Okay. Now, this also affects other types of synchronicities as Jung originally was kind of formulating them. He himself was not especially interested in reincarnation, strangely. Karma and reincarnation, I think partly he wanted to differentiate himself from the theosophists around him, theosophists and anthroposophists. I mean, Rudolf Steiner was just down the road in Switzerland, and he wanted to maintain his viable connection to the scientific and medical community. And even though he pushed the envelope in so many ways, I mean, alchemy, astrology, the religious function of the psyche, all these things he'd just done so much. I think whether it was by choice or just by the nature of experience, for him personally, karma and reincarnation was not high on his list of breakthroughs that he was bringing into psychology. But you can see from the work of so many transpersonal psychologists in particular, and also spontaneous spiritual emergencies, spontaneous experiences like the one of that child having where he's reliving the death in World War II. There's a tremendous amount of evidence there about that suggests the importance of karmic and reincarnational dimensions of the human psyche. And in that case, what Jung would have called a synchronicity, that, oh, this child is saying these things, has the exact right name of the person who he says he was in a previous lifetime, and can identify how he died, and he's got a birthmark that looks just like that, etc. All those things called synchronicities by Jung, we can see in some ways may reflect a subtler form of causality, namely a kind of karmic causation that is orchestrating events in this life in a way that seems, if you don't have karma in your range of causal categories, you have to just say, wow, this is just a strange coincidence, or it's a synchronicity that suggests, we live in a very mysterious, enchanted universe. But once you bring in the idea of karma, and that there's a karmic dimension to the human unconscious, then you have a more specific framing of this category of experiences that does have a kind of causality at work. It's a karmic causal framework. Now I'm going to read you a most interesting case that is of another form of synchronicity as Jung would describe it. And as you're listening, I imagine that we've all had some experiences, something like this. This is a beautifully told story by the Australian eco-philosopher Freya Matthews. And these are her words. The protagonist in this story was a vine, which once grew in my backyard. It was a solandra vine, a plant of extraordinary vitality and an Henri Rousseau-esque aspect with oversized glossy leaves. I had planted it myself and had had to save it several times, relocating it to more suitable sites in the garden. Eventually, I found a place for it against the side fence where it flourished most exuberantly. I felt a keen affection for and involvement with that plant. I watched it grow from day to day and got to know its habit well. Its unreserved joy of life was infectious, and it added a lift to my step as I went out each day. It grew happily in the spot that I had chosen for it, and after some years, it covered the whole fence. One day, however, our neighbor, who detested jubilant foliage of any kind, announced his plan to lay a concrete trench on his side of the boundary. This entailed cutting through the core of the solandra's root system, and hence certain and immediate death for the plant. There was nothing I could do. I mourned for my plant friend. I sat by it, spent time with it. The morning of the execution, I went out onto the veranda to say my last farewells, only to find that the vine had put forth a single extraordinary bloom, a huge yellow trumpet flower. It had never flowered before, and I had no idea that solandras bloomed at all, they being quite rare in gardens so far south. But there it was, a magnificent swan song in flower. I was profoundly moved, and though the plant was indeed killed that day, I felt that it had given something of itself to me, something precious. Few human responses could have moved me more. So I share that story because, again, this is something that in Jung's original formulation of synchronicity in the early 50s, he would regard this as a synchronicity. The plant is about to die, and it has a lot of meaning for the person who planted it, and synchronistically, just before it's about to be killed, it blossoms in this beautiful, magnificent way. But I think we could revision our sense of what was happening in that case, and I know that Freya would agree with this, by realizing that this is not simply a kind of acausal coincidence that is meaningful to her and matches what's been going on inside her. It is a sign of a relationship between her and the plant, the Salandra plant, in some sentient way, responded within the relationship to its imminent departure from its friend. And by blossoming, there was meaning, there was communication. Look at that word meaning, by the way. It means, see, when we use the word I mean this, I'm saying I intend this. I intend to communicate this significance. So meaning has an element of intention. Something needs to be, for there to be meaning, somebody has to be meaning something. And that is an intention, and that involves agency. And that plant had agency that was communicated in the flowering of the blossom. So again, in this case, we can call this synchronicity, but we could also call it a recognition of plant intelligence and plant sentience, which more and more plant biologists are coming to recognize. There's been great literature on this in recent years. Even the New Yorker had a great article on it a few weeks ago by Michael Pollan, well worth looking up, summarizing a lot of the recent evidence. See, what we can see now in retrospect, that Jung labored so hard to get the whole phenomenon of synchronicity into the intellectual discourse of mid-20th century, the mid-20th century worldview and zeitgeist, because he saw this as a way of breaking through the mechanistic linear stronghold of mainstream scientific causality. And he basically then took all these phenomena, parapsychology, paranormal phenomena, quantum physics phenomena, and he brought them all together into this one category that he called synchronicity, even when they no longer reflected the term synchronicity, which means basically happening at the same time, with time, chronos. Even the parapsychology evidence that involves precognition, where a person has a dream or a vision or a conviction that something's going to happen 10 years from now or 5 days from now, and then it happens. He called that a synchronicity, even though there's nothing synchronous about it. They're separated by 5 years. And again, if you bring in a point of view that takes seriously the fact that there can be a way in which a human being could access something that's going to happen in the future, that human beings have a kind of extended mind in that sense. This is not literally a synchronicity. It's more of an expression of a more mysterious world in which, in this case, human beings and human consciousness has more cards in its hand than it's been playing in the modern poker game. And so some theorists of synchronicity in more recent years have suggested that we take the parapsychological, the paranormal phenomena, and put that into one area of study, but then the synchronicities of the type, like the golden scarab coming in the window, be regarded as synchronicities per se. One easy way of differentiating between the two. When you have precognition or telekinesis or telepathy, in all those cases, that's saying something about the human being that we need to expand our sense of human potential, that human beings have greater access to knowledge than the mainstream mechanistic worldview where you basically have only your sensory apparatus that can tell you things that are happening in a more immediate way, or by you learning about it in some other way by, again, more linear forms. Somebody told you this, you read it in a reliable source, that type of thing, photograph. But the difference between the paranormal, parapsychological phenomena and the synchronicities that are of the type where you have the world, the silver fox is coming by right as you're talking about the dream. A person, the Charles Harvey example I gave yesterday, where mourning having a memorial for Charles Harvey, and in a place that had not been planned at all, but just went to on the spur of the moment. And there, as we're having the memorial, just attend, look to the side, and there on a plaque in the church is Lieutenant Colonel Charles Harvey from another century, whose burial happened right there, and had the plaque sitting right where the ceremony is taking place with no planning. That seems to be as if nature itself, or the world itself, is so imbued with meaning, and it's as if more the whole is communicating to the part, namely to the human consciousness, rather than the part, the human consciousness, reaching out with its extraordinary potential, human potential, and being able to see into the future, or telepathically connect with another person. And so in retrospect, if you think about what Jung was dealing with back then, I think he swept everything into the acausal synchronicity category that didn't fit into mainstream scientific understanding of linear causality, because he saw this as a great way of just saying he was very much into twos, there's anima and animus, there's conscious and unconscious, etc. Well, in this case, there's causality, and then there's synchronicity, acausality, and everything fit into those two categories. And he labored hard to basically radically expand and transform the modern worldview in that way. But I think the more we are able to see that there are subtle forms of causation at work in the plant that is blossoming, in communication with its beloved friend, and there was a relationship there. See, I think that golden scarab that came in the window, I mean, you could say, well, maybe the golden scarab heard the dream was coming and thought, here, this is a job for me, I'm going to get in that window. Maybe. I don't want to underestimate our arthropod friends. But what's more persuasive to me is that nature itself, the whole, was basically in its overflow of meaning and significance, and the urge, in some sense, to support the unfolding of this person's own life. Life itself conspired to orchestrate events in such a way to awaken her in this case. Now, this points to one of the most important things about synchronicity that's been developed since Jung's work, and that is the implications for religion that synchronicity has. Robert Aziz, A-Z-I-Z, did a very fine book maybe 20-some years ago called Synchronicity and Jung's Psychology of Religion. And in it, he said, the synchronicity concept is arguably the single theory with the most far-reaching implications for Jung's psychology as a whole, particularly for his psychology of religion. Very interesting, because this is kind of, that's coming from the religious side. Do you remember the quote that I gave from Vic Mansfield, the physicist, yesterday? I don't have it right in front of me, but he just said these synchronicities, which he's experienced way too many of them himself and observed them in others to be able to deny them, but they present tremendous philosophical and psychological challenges for our worldview. And then he said, they're especially troubling experiences for me as a physicist trained within the culture of scientific materialism. So both the science discipline or category of disciplines in the academic world and the humanities and the social sciences, namely psychology and psychology of religion, both of those disciplines have these kind of paradigm statements saying this totally changes the playing field, these synchronistic phenomena. And what Aziz is pointing out is that synchronicities represented for Jung it brought about an enormous change in his whole kind of meta-psychology and his understanding of religion in the modern human experience. And why is that? Well, if you look back at Jung's work on the importance of religious experience and the nature of religious experience in his early to mid-career, and remember, for Jung, religion and numinosity was central to his psychology and psychotherapy. I mean, for him, healing took place when the numinous appeared. Healing, deep psychotherapeutic healing, entailed the presence of the numinous, of the sacred, and that behind every symptom, ultimately, was something where there was a numinous dimension. And whenever you access the archetype in some direct way, the numinous is present. So religious experience and the numinous were very important for Jung. That's why when he met William James, just before James died during Jung's first trip to the States with Freud, James wasn't that impressed with Freud, but he was very impressed with the young Jung, who was just young Jung. Jung liked the idea that Freud, who was the psychologist of the pleasure principle, had the name Freud, which is joy, Freud, and that Jung had the name, who was the psychologist of the death rebirth process, and had the name Jung. But Jung he got an inspiration from William James, who took religious experience seriously and whose book, Varieties of Religious Experience, really is one of those books that we wouldn't be here if that book hadn't been written. I mean, in some ways, William James really helped lay out a bridge from the mainstream Western modern intellectual tradition to the larger range of human experience in the psyche and in religious experience. Now, if you look at when Jung came to the United States and gave his famous talk later at Yale in 1937 for the Terry lectures, he talked about the modern religious condition, and he said true religious experience now for the modern, who has had all the old covenants have been shattered. All the old symbol systems have been lost for so many modern intellectual types who have taken in modern science. The stars have fallen from the heavens, as he put it, and that's why we have psychology, because that's where we're going to access the symbols. That's where we can reconnect to the archetypes. And he said, the one way in which we can have authentic religious experience is within the sacred circle of the human psyche, the deep human psyche. Deep in the unconscious is where the numinous exists. Through dreams, through visions, through religious experience that could just spontaneously emerge. In all these ways, it is the deep archetypal psyche inside the human being where the encounter with the divine takes place, almost like inside the intrasubjective domain. Within synchronicities, once he took in synchronicities, and it was a long, gradual process, I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Once synchronicities came into his understanding, first of all, he had to revision his understanding of archetypes, so that archetypes were now seen not just as intrapsychic fundamental structures that inform the human psyche. They seem to inform the material world as well, nature. It's inner and outer. And he used the term psychoid, that the archetypes are psychoid. They behave in psyche-like ways, even when they are coming through in the form of the golden scarab coming in the window, or the silver fox going across the path. He used to pay attention to when in his therapy room, when there was a greater charge emotionally in the room, as they were talking about a dream or an interpersonal situation of high drama, and there was getting to be intensity. He would note that the waves on the lake just outside his home, when he was meeting them in the garden room in his home in Kusnak, the waves would get stronger. The wind would seem to pick up. Or he'd pay attention to the sudden landing of a flock of birds, or their sudden departure, the movements of animals, the movements of the wind and the waves. These were all, this is Plotinus's idea that everything breathes together. He was so alert to that. And he was recognizing that nature itself was the source of the archetypal, not just, it was, and so at this point, he radically opened up his sense of what was supporting the religious process in a human being, namely the sacred circle within which the encounter with the divine and transformation by the divine was taking place was no longer just intrasubjective human. It was all of nature, the whole universe was in some sense supporting the healing process, the individuation process, the spiritual journey. It's a kind of eco-spiritual transformation of psychology, a kind of cosmological transformation of psychology. It starts to embed the psyche in a larger whole. I think this conference is very much a reflection of that. This is for those of you, I teach in a program called at CIS called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness, and with Stan Groff and Brian Swim and Joanna Macy and so forth. And so we get kind of deeply into in the same way that we heard this morning, Jim going into all the fine details of analysis of the reincarnation experiences. We're doing this with a lot of phenomena, and if you pay close attention to the philosophical side of Jung's psychology, he would always point to Kant. He was a Kantian to the end in terms of his vocal allegiance, because Kant gave him a way of talking about phenomena like mystical experiences and the archetypal psyche that allowed him to say, look, I'm just being an empiricist. This is just what the reports, subjective reports are from the human beings that I'm dealing with in my life. I'm not saying anything metaphysical, that this is the way things are. All I know is that God exists in human beings' experience. I'm not saying God, he's trying to keep his kind of contemporary scientific credentials and a kind of postmodern, but opening it up in a kind of postmodern, flexible, non-ontologically committed way. But then, of course, in the next sentence, he'd say something that was pretty metaphysical. And clearly, in his later years, even though he never kind of corrected that commitment to Kant, he had transcended it. And he would say, look, he said, I agree entirely with the mythologist Karl Karenyi when he says that in the symbol, the world itself is speaking. See, Kant would say, we don't know what the world in itself is saying. We only know what the human psyche is subjectively reading into and reading out of what the world is. We don't know what the world in itself is saying. Jung, with synchronicities, I think in particular in mind, is saying, in the symbol, the world itself is speaking. And at that point, Jung fully reconnects to the primordial worldview of the participation mystique, the anima mundi, the world soul, which speaks mythically, it speaks symbolically. Its language is archetypal, and that is the way that human beings and nature, the rest of nature that human beings are part of, can communicate. In the symbol, the world itself is speaking. Now let's look at negative synchronicity, or the negative and the shadow side of synchronicity, which I alluded to the other day, but didn't go into. Let's see, we go to 11:30, so we got 18 minutes. Okay, one form of synchronicities that have a problematic dimension is, they're sometimes called negative synchronicities. Think of the phenomenon we call the perfect storm, where everything kind of converges with uncanny precision to cause a bummer of an experience for us. And then they can happen in waves, just like really, just like, what is going on? One feels, as it were, victimized by not just indifferent hostile forces of random life, but at a certain point, it's like, what do you have against me? That kind of sense of there's actually some kind of a negative constellating trickster that is just aiming at your discomfort or defeat, not just discomfort, but defeat. And I believe those two are authentic synchronicities. Now the question is, what's going on there? I think there is an archetype, the spoiler archetype, the negative trickster. You often see it at work in hard aspects between Saturn and Uranus in transits. And in this case, you could say, on the one hand, there is this kind of schadenfreude delight that the cosmos might be taking in really lining things up and defeating this person, or like God and the devil treating Job in the Hebrew Bible. But there's another level at which we often see when people are in their own spiritual journeys going through approaching a threshold of what Groff calls ego death, certain parts of the perinatal journey, the death rebirth journey, where you're really getting expelled from the womb, you're having to experience total isolation, alienation, the defeat of any sense of personal importance. If you have accessed a very deep level of the psyche where that perinatal and archetypal domain is just flooding into your life, and then you come out of, let's say, a sacred medicine ceremony or a breathwork session or something like that, or just in psychotherapy, and you're still deeply in process, you've not at all integrated it, but it's been activated. It's really flooding into your consciousness. One can very easily start to notice that it's as if you're magnetically attracting negative experiences towards you that keep the process going of defeating you, of bringing you down. In that sense, the universe does seem to have it in for you, but it seems to be ultimately in the service of ego death, in the same way that the baby who's getting expelled from the womb is generally not feeling too great about it. It's getting contracted, it's getting compressed, it's losing connection to its source of oxygen. As the umbilical cord's getting squeezed, it's losing the whole universe that's benignly, nourishingly contained it for seeming infinity of time, and then all suddenly it's turning against one and one's being expelled. Things do not seem like they're going in the right direction here. And then birth happens, and the reconnection to the Great Mother, to the source of the. Not only is there a reconnection to the nourishing matrix of life, there is a sudden aha recognition, a discernment in the person who experiences rebirth of like, oh, now I see that the only way I could have gotten to be born was to die, was to lose everything that I thought was important to me. I had to lose that. The thing that we most feared, that was the very via regia, royal way to get to that which is most precious to me now. So that's the death rebirth mystery essentially contained in that. And so negative synchronicities still can have the deep telos, the deep meaning or purpose at work of moving towards wholeness, moving towards individuation, moving towards rebirth out of the death of the limited ego and the birth of access to a larger, higher self. But it's not pretty when it's happening, and it can actually feel like one's being ganged up on by life. So that's one form of the shadow side of synchronicities that we could talk about. There's another form, though. Jung noticed that sometimes when there'd be a lot of patterns of events that would happen that seemed to have a very characteristic negative focus that was focused right on a person, there'd be a response by the individual involved that this was indeed part of a larger pattern that was quite meaningful, but the meaning was hostile, and it was directed by hidden, malevolent human forces. It was like a form of paranoia, where you would put all these things together, and perhaps a lot of other things together, and be absolutely sure that that there was a plot against one. And Jung pointed out that in these cases, the interpretation of the synchronistic phenomena, first of all, tends to be infused with a certain morbidity of perception. Secondly, it tends to be very egocentric. It's all about me. It's all being directed at me. I'm the helpless victim of it. There are negative forces, and they're aimed at me. aliens from Mars have implanted this in my tooth, and it's drawing all these negative things towards me, that type of ideation. Or it's the, it's the KGB or the CIA. Sometimes it is the NSA, I guess, in particular. We might be vigilant. And this is where discernment comes in. It's not always all in our heads. But in the case of authentic paranoia, it is a response to potentially synchronistic phenomena, but that gets turned into, first of all, a more morbid, a more egocentric, and typically a human-focused. It's like the source is coming from other human beings who have malevolent intentions, rather than seeing it as part of a larger unfolding of the individuation process embedded in nature and life itself. And then there's a third shadow form of synchronicity I want to call attention to, and that's the case, that's where it's a positive type of synchronicity as it's experienced, but there's a sense of inflation that goes with it. I mentioned it yesterday a bit. There's a kind of sense of hubris, a sense of, wow, I am the center of cosmic attention. Like everything that happens here is just arranged and orchestrated so perfectly for my own happiness. I'm just so thrilled about that. And now I think at some level there is a way in which everything is subtly organized, orchestrated for our own deep unfolding. But it often involves a lot of tragic dimensions, losses, defeats, and it is also part of a larger superstructure of amazing complexity in which every other being is also the center of cosmic focus, and it's not just all about me. So that kind of narcissistic inflation that we sometimes see in synchronicity interpretations in kind of New Age contexts can be a kind of misleading distortion. And Jung always emphasized, he said, it's that type of interpretation is like a pre-Copernican interpretation where you're reorganizing everything to be centered around you. He said it's really a heliocentric world in which it's the sun as in this case, the self archetype is the true center. That's what's orchestrating the phenomena. That's the center, and the triumph of the self and its emergence in our lives often involves the defeat of the ego. Now, sometimes he said that in an almost absolute way, that it's always a defeat for the ego and a victory for the self. I think that is perhaps too strong a term, because there are many synchronicities that can happen to a person, for example, where that person has a kind of uncertainty, a kind of tentative, they're like a fawn whose legs are not strong enough yet, but they're feeling like they're getting an intuition or a calling of like what they could become, but they're very uncertain. And then there's synchronicities that happen that, as it were, sort of throw a lifeline to that person or give a sense of affirmation. No, this is the right direction you're going on. It isn't always you're knocking you off your ego's direction and going to find your true way. Sometimes you're tentatively moving uncertainly and unconfidently, but with like a little spark of the divine. It's like giving you that intuition, what Campbell is always talking about with follow your bliss. It's that passion that is calling you to become. I love Nietzsche's become what thou art. Become what thou art perfectly conveys the fact that it's both what you already are, but it's what you are still becoming, and that present and future combined is what makes up the magic of the quest we're in. So in this particular case, I think we can see that some synchronicities actually affirm the budding the budding ego, even if we don't demonize the ego. I mean, the ego the ego can be defined many ways. It can be just a kind of rational calculator of payoffs. In the Freudian sense, negotiating between the superego and the id and the external world in a kind of instrumentalist, calculative way. But the ego is also, it just means I in Latin. The ego is that sense of who I am, which as an identity, as an individual, and that's part of what needs to grow. It has to go through its journey. It has to be defeated. It has to go through all sorts of suffering. That's what Keats meant when he said soul making. This world is a veil of soul making. It's the individuality within us that somehow draws towards it and needs to go through all these difficult circumstances and sufferings and pain as part of becoming who we are and rising to our true essence. So some synchronicities in that sense actually can support the fledgling intimations of where one was already going but was not certain yet. So now how do we correct for, if that's the right word, how do we be more skillful navigators of synchronicities, given these kind of traps of narcissism on the one hand or paranoia on the other? If you look at the narcissistic situation, there is such a kind of unconscious craving for meaning, and that I am the center of meaning, that it gets magnified to monstrous proportions, so that it distorts things in order to feed this sense of I'm important, I'm significant. And if we look at the paranoid interpretation, that too is in some sense coming from the personal unconscious of, like, there's a post-traumatic anxiety and fear, a complex that is just distorting things so that you keep reliving the trauma. Here's another enemy coming because I was abused this last lab. Here comes another one, even though it's a neutral person, perhaps even a friendly one. But if you come at them in a hostile way, they're eventually going to withdraw or become hostile themselves. And you say, in the self-fulfilling prophecy, like, I knew that guy was hostile. Meanwhile, the person has constellated it, drawn it out of the other person with great skill very often. The unconscious is very skillful at shaping reality to fulfill its own unconscious complex. So, in all these cases, what's missing is adequate self-discernment. We need more quiet, contemplative, lucid self-inquiry, self-investigation, self-honesty. Often this happens. I know that Graham was talking very intensively last night about one of the gifts of ayahuasca medicine is very much like what seems to happen very often towards the very end of life or in near-death experiences, is what you get a very vivid recognition of the shadow side of your behavior, and it comes back how you were unkind to this person, how your unconsciousness in that situation caused all these problematic results, and then you have to take in the consequences of it. Well, that type of experience in non-ordinary states can be very, very transformative for making one both more self-aware and more humble. and recognizing that we've all got a shadow. It's always, there's a lot more where that came from. And we need to be in a kind of ceaseless dialogue with that potentiality within us. So you need both self-discernment on the one hand, look towards the interior, but then also discernment of the outer on the other. Like, let me compare it to romantic experience. When, okay, I'm going to finish up here because I can see we're at 11:30. When one falls in love, it can just be, it's such an overpowering experience. The archetypal being, as it were, of Aphrodite and Eros, they just infuse into one. One falls into the Aphrodite archetype, as Hillman would put it, and it totally transforms one's vision, one's physical response to things, heart beating. So Hillman would talk about it as being virtually like an illness that would overtake one. It's an archetypal complex. Does that mean it just needs to be kind of owned and then just see, oh, that person's just another person. I'm seeing the divine, perfect partner in them, but that's really in me, and I've got to be more discerning, and this is just another person, and there goes the end of the romance. Or alternatively, do I totally follow that sense of, this is the person, I'm totally in love with you, it doesn't even matter how you feel about me, we're going to be together, and that kind, the stalker phenomenon. And then alternatively, you have the person who is, where even both of them, in a kind of folie à deux, often MDMA infused or alcohol, ecstasy, or you go to, where then it's the next morning they wake up and realize, what was I thinking? Or 10 years later, what was I thinking or seeing, And in all these cases, it's a case where the unconscious complex has so shaped the external vision that one has not adequately discerned or listened to the other. The other wasn't interested in you, but that didn't matter because you get that absolute assurance when you're in a possession state by an archetype. Okay. Now, what's required in each case is an I-thou relationship with the actual other, and that rather than an I-it relationship where you're just looking at the other as an object of your needs, and you project onto them, you are the perfect person to be with me, no matter what. And that kind of discernment that penetrates through the I-it relationship to an I-thou relationship is one that involves listening and a mutuality of relating, out of which can emerge an authentic divine romance. Because if I'm seeing the divine in the other person, and it's not just in me, the other person actually is carrying a divine in them. And maybe those two divinities are in fact part of a sacred marriage archetype. One can't just write that off as being, oh, this is just another projection. Then you get lost in the solipsistic, I'm just always doing psychology and I'm never getting in a real relationship. Then the challenge is holding the magic and the paradox of being both human. You've got a human, all too human partner, and you yourself are all too human, but you're also both carrying the divine beloved in oneself. And so to carry that kind of magical paradox and uncertainty of the two together, divine and human. Okay, that's romantic relationship. Now to apply it quickly to the synchronicity. In the case of synchronicities, we all need to basically, on the one hand, not have an I-it relationship to it and just say, oh, that's just mere coincidence. When you listen to some materialistic scientists, what kind of amazing synchronicities they can basically say, oh, that's nothing but, it's another statistical fluke. Yeah, all sorts of rationalizations in order to not feel the impact of an authentic synchronicity. That's an I-it relationship to the world. The world is just a mechanistic phenomenon. It's disenchanted. It's been neutralized. While an I-thou relationship permits a connection to the potential meaningfulness of the synchronicity. But you can also, in the narcissistic mode or the paranoid mode, project onto the coincidences your own need for meaning, a negative meaning in the case of paranoia, and it's all coming from this plot, or the inflated meaning of the narcissist who says everything is focused on superior me, I am the center of cosmic attention, and not really having an I-thou relationship to the synchronicity. It's an I-it relationship because you're projecting your psychological need and complex onto something rather than listening to what is actually being said, being intended. So those are some of the nuances and ways of evolving skillful means for dealing with this great mysterious phenomenon of synchronicity, which we've had now 2 days to explore in this great conference. Thank you very much.